The Harper family stood at the edge of their new driveway, gazing up at the house that would soon become their home. It wasn't perfect. The paint on the shutters was peeling, and the yard needed attention. But to Ellen and Mark Harper, it represented a chance to leave the chaos of the city behind. For their kids, 12-year-old Jake and 9-year-old Lily, it was an adventure waiting to happen. "Look at all this space," Jake said, his eyes wide as he surveyed the yard. "We can finally play soccer without worrying about hitting cars." Lily twirled in place, arms stretched out. "And we can plant flowers. Can we, Mum?" Ellen smiled at their enthusiasm. "We can do whatever we want. It's ours now." Mark pulled the last box from the moving truck. "We've got a lot of unpacking to do before we can start decorating," he said, grinning at the kids. "How about you two start exploring inside while we bring the rest of the stuff in?" "Deal," Jake said, already heading for the front door. The house was larger than their cramped apartment had been, with wide hallways and a staircase that creaked just enough to feel charming. The kids raced from room to room, claiming their spaces and shouting excitedly when they found hidden nooks in closets or old-fashioned light switches that flicked on fixtures with an antique glow. Downstairs, Ellen and Mark marveled at the sheer quiet of the neighborhood. No car alarms, no honking horns, just the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere on the block. "This is exactly what we needed," Mark said, wrapping an arm around Ellen's shoulders. "A fresh start." Ellen nodded, taking in the tall windows that filled the living room with golden afternoon light. "It's perfect. I just hope it's as peaceful as it seems." Their conversation was interrupted by Lily's voice, echoing from the basement door. "Mom, Dad, you have to see this!" Mark and Ellen exchanged a glance. "That didn't take long," Mark joked. "What is it, sweetie?" "There's something cool down here," Lily called back, her tone more curious than worried. The two parents followed the sound of her voice down the narrow basement stairs. The space below was unfinished, with exposed beams and a cold concrete floor. Old shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty paint cans and cobweb jars. But it was Lily, standing at the far end, who caught their attention. She was pointing at a door. Not just any door, it was made of old wood, reinforced with heavy iron hinges. The frame was slightly crooked, as if it had been added long after the house was built. It didn't match the basement's utilitarian design. "What do you think's behind it?" Lily asked, her eyes wide. Ellen frowned. "I have no idea. I don't remember seeing that on the house tour." Mark stepped forward, inspecting the door's handle. "It's locked. Probably nothing. Old storage or something." But as the family stood there, a faint chill seemed to seep into the air. Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that the door hadn't been opened in a long time, and that whatever was inside was waiting to be found. Over the next few days, life at the new house settled into a comfortable routine. Boxes were unpacked, curtains were hung, and the kids began exploring the neighborhood. Ellen and Mark were busy juggling work and renovations, but every now and then their thoughts drifted back to the locked door in the basement. "What do you think it is?" Mark asked one evening as they sat in the living room, sipping coffee after the kids had gone to bed. Ellen shook her head. "I don't know. I mean, the previous owners didn't mention anything about a locked room. It's not in the listing or the home inspection report." "Probably nothing," Mark said, though his tone was less certain than his words. "Old houses have weird quirks." Ellen nodded, but she couldn't shake the curiosity that had been growing since they first discovered it. "Maybe we should open it, just to be sure." "Sure," Mark said with a shrug. "I'll see if I can find the key tomorrow." But tomorrow turned into the next day, and then the day after that. Life was busy, and the door remained locked. Jake and Lily, however, hadn't forgotten. They brought it up every chance they got. "Did you open it yet?" Jake asked at breakfast one morning. "Not yet," Ellen replied. "We've got other things to do first." But it's so cool, Lily said. What if there's treasure in there? Or a monster, Jake teased, wiggling his fingers at Lily. Stop it, she protested, but a small smile tugged at her lips. All right, Mark said, setting down his coffee. I'll check it out tonight. If it's locked, we'll find a way to get it open. No monsters, no treasure, just some dusty old storage, I'm sure. That evening, after dinner and dishes, Mark headed down to the basement with a flashlight in one hand and a set of old keys he'd found in the kitchen drawer. Ellen followed, holding the flashlight steady as Mark tried each key on the heavy iron lock. One by one, they failed to fit. Maybe it's just rusted shut, Ellen suggested. Could be, Mark said, leaning closer. He jiggled the last key, then sighed. None of these work. What now? Ellen asked. Mark straightened up and glanced at the tool rack on the wall. I'll try some WD-40 tomorrow. If that doesn't work, I'll drill out the lock. Ellen nodded, feeling both relief and a twinge of disappointment. Part of her had hoped to solve the mystery right away, but another part of her wondered what they would find when they finally opened that door. As they headed back upstairs, the basement felt colder than usual. Neither of them commented on it, but Ellen could tell Mark had noticed it too. For now, they'd leave it alone, but the locked door wasn't going to remain a secret forever. It was late one afternoon when Mark finally decided to tackle the door head-on. Armed with a drill, a flashlight, and a dose of determination, he descended into the basement. Ellen followed a few steps behind, carrying a crowbar just in case. Jake and Lily, despite being told to stay upstairs, hovered near the top of the stairs, their curiosity impossible to contain. Mark knelt in front of the iron lock, examining its aged surface. This thing hasn't been touched in decades, he muttered. Ellen nodded. Do you think it was sealed on purpose? I mean, why would they lock it and then leave it like this? Mark shrugged. Could be anything. Old junk, forgotten storage. Let's find out. He pressed the drill's bit against the lock, and with a whirring sound, the tool began to bite into the metal. Sparks flew, and after a few minutes the lock gave a sharp crack and fell away. The door creaked slightly, as if responding to the newfound freedom. Mark pushed the door open cautiously. It swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow space beyond. The smell of damp earth and aged wood wafted out, causing Ellen to wrinkle her nose. What is that smell? She asked, shining the flashlight into the void. Musty, like old dirt, Mark replied. He stepped inside, the beam of light cutting through the thick shadows. The room was small, no more than 10 by 10 feet, with low ceilings and walls lined with wooden shelves. Each shelf was packed with dusty crates, old jars, and strange metal instruments that gleamed faintly in the light. Whoa, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's a workshop? Ellen stepped in behind him, scanning the shelves. The jars contained murky, discolored liquids, while the metal instruments looked like a mix between old tools and something more scientific. Intricate gauges, coiled wires, and small machines with glass tubes. A large, flat wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred and darkened by years of use. This doesn't look like a normal basement room, Ellen said. It's, strange. Mark ran his fingers along the edge of one of the machines, brushing away a layer of dust. Maybe someone used this for a hobby. Electronics, chemistry, something technical. But why lock it up? Ellen wondered aloud. And why didn't anyone know about it when we bought the house? As they continued to explore, Mark noticed a stack of old notebooks on the far shelf. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with dense handwriting and diagrams. He picked one up carefully, flipping through the pages. Blueprints, he said. These are plans for something electrical, I think. Circuits. But these symbols, they don't look standard. Ellen glanced over his shoulder. It's like they were working on something secret. The children's voices echoed faintly from upstairs, calling out, "What's in there? Did you find anything?" Mark looked at Ellen, his expression serious. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "We found something, but I'm not sure what it is yet." Over the next few days, Mark and Ellen pored over the notebooks they'd found in the basement. The handwriting was cramped, looping in places and sharp in others, as if the author had been writing in a hurry. The diagrams were even more puzzling. Wires branching out from central nodes, strange symbols that didn't match any electrical standard Mark had ever seen, and handwritten notations in the margins that hinted at something more than simple technical instructions. "I'm telling you, these aren't just blueprints for some old project," Mark said one evening, spreading the notebooks out on the kitchen table. "It's like whoever made these was working on something advanced. Way more advanced than what you'd expect from a home workshop." Ellen leaned over, squinting at one of the pages. "And what about these notes? Phase 2 initiated. Subject response unstable." What were they even doing down there? Mark shook his head. "I don't know. But it's not just repairs or tinkering. This looks like experimentation." They tried researching the house's previous owners, but the trail went cold after the original builder, who had died decades earlier. No record of anyone running a lab, no mention of experimental equipment in any property listing. The house had simply passed hands a few times before coming to them. Their curiosity deepened as they unearthed more details. One notebook included a faded newspaper clipping tucked between the pages. The article mentioned a local inventor who had vanished mysteriously in the 1940s. The name didn't match any records from the house, but the location was just a few miles away. The inventor had been known for his work on early electrical devices. Some even claimed he'd been experimenting with wireless power transmission long before it became practical. "Do you think this guy could be connected to our house?" Ellen asked, holding up the clipping. "It's possible," Mark said, tapping the table. "Maybe he knew the original owner. Maybe they collaborated on something." Ellen frowned. "But if they were working on a breakthrough, why lock it away? Why keep it hidden all these years?" Mark shrugged. "Could be anything. Maybe they had a falling out. Maybe something went wrong." The couple continued digging, following every lead they could find. Old city records, forgotten archives, even local rumors. They visited the Historical Society and found a single mention of the house's basement. A brief note in a ledger described additional storage space installed at the owner's request, but no further details. That night, as Mark and Ellen sat in the living room, surrounded by scattered notes and diagrams, a thought struck Ellen. What if it's not about what they built? What if it's about what they found? Mark looked at her, the wheels turning in his mind. If that's the case, then maybe the basement isn't just a workshop. Maybe it's a hiding place. The question lingered between them. If the secret room wasn't just a workshop, then what exactly was it hiding? Determined to find answers, Mark and Ellen decided to go back into the basement and comb through every inch of the space. This time, they brought better lights, gloves, and a set of tools to carefully open any boxes or compartments they hadn't touched before. Jake and Lily, who had grown tired of hearing their parents speculate, stood at the top of the stairs, leaning over the railing. "Can we come help?" Jake asked. "Not this time," Ellen called up. "We don't know what we'll find." "Come on," Lily whined. "It's not fair." "Stay upstairs," Mark said firmly. "We'll let you know if we find anything." Reluctantly, the kids retreated to the living room. Ellen shut the basement door, and together she and Mark descended the creaking stairs. The room seemed colder than before, the air heavy with that musty metallic scent. They started on the shelves, carefully moving jars and old instruments aside, searching for hidden compartments or additional notes. The heavy wooden table in the center of the room still drew their attention, but for now, they focused on the perimeter. Ellen opened a crate that contained what looked like weathered components of an old radio or transmitter. Maybe this is where those diagrams came from, she said, holding up a dusty coil of copper wire. Some kind of prototype. Could be, Mark said, but it still doesn't explain why it was locked up, or why there's no record of any of this. As they worked, Ellen noticed a small, uneven section of the back wall. It looked like a patch of bricks had been removed and then hastily replaced. "Mark," she said, pointing. "Look at this." Mark came over, running his hand along the wall. "That's not original. Someone sealed this off." They grabbed a small hammer and chisel from the toolkit and carefully chipped away at the mortar. With each brick they removed, the room grew quieter. The only sound, the faint scrape of metal on stone. After several minutes, they'd cleared a narrow opening just large enough to peek inside. "What's in there?" Ellen whispered, peering into the dark void. Mark shone a flashlight through the gap. Inside was a small alcove, no bigger than a storage locker. And in the center, resting on a pedestal of worn stone, was a strange object. It was a metallic sphere about the size of a grapefruit, covered in intricate etchings that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. Tiny, interconnected circuits ran across its surface, forming patterns that didn't resemble anything Mark had ever seen. "What is that?" Ellen asked, her voice hushed. Mark reached in carefully, brushing away cobwebs. "I don't know," he said, his hand hovering just above the sphere. "But I think we just found what they were hiding." Mark and Ellen carefully removed the sphere from its resting place, cradling it as though it were made of glass. It was heavier than it looked, the weight surprising given its relatively small size. The circuits that crisscrossed its surface seemed to pulse faintly under the beam of their flashlight, as if responding to their presence. "This doesn't look like anything from the 1940s, Ellen said, her voice low. Mark nodded, turning the object over in his hands. "It's not just old, it's advanced. Way more advanced than anything I've seen. But if it's so important, why would someone just leave it here? Why seal it up?" Ellen glanced around the dim basement, the shadows stretching in the corners. Maybe they didn't mean to leave it. Maybe something happened, and they never came back. Mark set the sphere on the work table, and for a moment they both just stared at it. "We need to figure out what this is," he said, "and who made it." Ellen reached out, running her fingers lightly over the etched surface. The moment she touched it, a faint hum filled the air. Both of them froze. The hum was soft at first, like a distant vibration, but it grew stronger, resonating through the room. The dim light seemed to flicker, the shadows shifting unnaturally. "Did you hear that?" Ellen whispered. Mark nodded, his jaw tight. "It's not just a hum. It feels like energy, like it's alive." The sphere's circuits glowed faintly, a pulsing rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Mark took a step back, suddenly unsure. "Maybe we shouldn't mess with it," he said. "If this thing's been hidden for decades, there might be a good reason." Ellen hesitated. "But if it's dangerous, shouldn't we know? Shouldn't we figure out what it can do?" As they debated, the hum subsided, and the room fell still again. The sphere's glow faded, leaving only the faint etchings on its surface. Ellen placed her hand on Mark's arm. "Let's move it upstairs. It's too cold down here, and we need more light." Reluctantly, Mark agreed. They wrapped the sphere in a thick cloth and carried it up the basement stairs. Once in the kitchen, they set it on the counter under the warm glow of the overhead lights. The object looked less intimidating in the bright, familiar space, but it still held an undeniable air of mystery. Ellen picked up one of the notebooks and flipped to the most detailed blueprint. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of concentric circles and lines. "I think this diagram matches the patterns on the sphere." Mark studied it, his brow furrowed. "If that's true, then maybe these notes are instructions. They could tell us what it is." They exchanged a glance, the unspoken agreement clear. This discovery was bigger than their house, bigger than the basement, and they couldn't turn back now. The next morning, Ellen spread the notebooks out on the dining table, marking pages with sticky notes, while Mark brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The kids, sensing the quiet seriousness in the air, stayed in the living room, occasionally peeking in but keeping their distance. "I think this is where they started," Ellen said, pointing to one of the earliest entries. "It talks about testing electrical fields and using specific frequencies. But look." She traced her finger down a list of notes. "This is when they mention the sphere for the first time." Mark leaned over her shoulder. "What does it say?" Ellen read aloud, her voice steady. "Subject appears to generate its own current. Attempts to replicate the field have been unsuccessful. Source remains unclear." Mark frowned. "They didn't build it. They found it." Ellen nodded. "Exactly. There's no mention of construction, just testing. Whatever this thing is, it didn't come from them." They pored over more pages, gradually piecing together a story. The notebooks described the original owner of the house discovering the sphere while digging a well. It had been buried deep, surrounded by fragments of stone that seemed unnatural. The owner had brought it inside, fascinated by its strange properties. Over the years, they had turned the basement into a makeshift laboratory, attempting to understand what they had uncovered. "There's a name here," Ellen said suddenly. "Dr. Arthur Welton." Mark's eyebrows lifted. "Is that the guy from the newspaper clipping?" Ellen flipped through the pages, comparing notes. "No, that was Dr. Raymond Hodge. But maybe they knew each other. If this Welton guy was the one who first found it, then maybe Hodge tried to help him figure it out." The more they read, the more apparent it became that the sphere was no ordinary object. The notebooks described how it seemed to react to certain frequencies, how its glow would intensify when exposed to a particular set of electrical currents. But every attempt to control it ended in failure. "Look at this," Mark said, pointing to a page near the back of one notebook. "They started sealing it up after this." Ellen scanned the entry. Subject emitted an unstable pulse. Walls shook. Instruments failed. Decision made to secure the object until proper containment could be devised. "That explains the locked room," Mark said. "They got scared. Whatever they were trying to do, it went sideways." Ellen leaned back, taking a deep breath. "So they locked it away. Maybe they thought it would be safer out of sight, and then, over time, it was forgotten." "But it's not forgotten anymore," Mark said. "We found it." Ellen looked down at the glowing sphere sitting on the counter, its surface etched with strange, faintly luminescent patterns. "If they couldn't figure it out, how are we supposed to?" That evening, Mark and Ellen sat in the kitchen with the sphere between them. The notebooks were open, and a small collection of tools and gadgets cluttered the table. Mark had pulled out an old multimeter, a few wires, and a power supply he used for his occasional electronics projects. The kids were upstairs, and the house was unusually quiet. "Okay," Mark said, running a hand through his hair. "We know the sphere reacts to electrical input. The notes mention certain frequencies and currents. If we can reproduce one of their tests, maybe we'll see what they saw." Ellen nodded but stayed back, her arms crossed. "Just be careful. They stopped for a reason, remember?" "Yeah," Mark replied, his voice lower. "But we're not trying anything crazy, just a low current to see what happens." He attached a wire to one of the multimeter probes and placed it against a faint groove on the sphere's surface. It wasn't immediately obvious if that groove was functional or decorative, but it was the closest thing they had to a connection point. The other probe remained in his hand, hovering over a second groove on the opposite side. "Ready?" he asked. Ellen didn't answer, but her tense posture said she was paying close attention. Mark touched the second probe to the sphere. At first, nothing happened. He adjusted the power supply slightly, increasing the current ever so carefully. The needle on the multimeter wavered, and the sphere emitted a faint hum. "There it is," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. The hum grew louder, resonating softly through the room. The etchings on the sphere's surface began to glow again, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Ellen took a cautious step closer. It's reacting, just like they said it would. Mark increased the frequency, matching one of the notes from the journals. The glow intensified, and the hum turned into a low, throbbing sound. The sphere seemed to vibrate slightly under his hand, the circuits on its surface forming shifting patterns of light. "It's beautiful," Ellen murmured, but her awe was tinged with unease. "Do you think we should stop?" Mark hesitated. They were so close to understanding what the original researchers had experienced. "One more adjustment," he said, "just to see." Before he could finish, the sphere emitted a sharp, clear tone that startled them both. The light from its circuits flared brighter than ever, casting strange shadows on the walls. The kitchen lights flickered, and a strange tension filled the air, making Ellen's hair stand on end. "Mark," she said urgently, "turn it off." He reached for the power supply, pulling the connection. The sphere's glow faded, and the humming stopped, leaving the kitchen eerily silent. "What was that?" Ellen asked, her voice shaking. Mark stared at the sphere, his heart pounding. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's not just a piece of old equipment." The house was quiet that night, but neither Mark nor Ellen could sleep. The glow of the sphere, the hum that still seemed to resonate in their minds, it was too much to ignore. While Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at the object they'd uncovered, Ellen was on the computer, digging deeper into the names and places mentioned in the notebooks. "Arthur Welton, Raymond Hodge," she murmured, scrolling through digital archives. "Come on, there's got to be something." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, filtering search results, narrowing date ranges, cross-referencing addresses. Eventually, she hit on a breakthrough, a small article buried in an old town newspaper, dated May 1939. "Got it," she said, motioning for Mark to join her. "What is it?" he asked, leaning over her shoulder. She pointed to the screen. The article was short, but intriguing. It described a local inventor named Dr. Arthur Welton, who had made a name for himself with innovative electrical devices. The piece mentioned that Welton had been working on something he called the resonance engine, a device intended to generate a new form of energy. The project was described as highly experimental and dangerous, and it ended abruptly when Welton disappeared without a trace. "Resonance engine," Mark repeated. "Do you think that's what we found?" Ellen nodded slowly. "It fits. The notebooks talk about resonance, frequencies, all that electrical experimentation. And if Welton disappeared, maybe the sphere was his prototype. Something went wrong and they sealed it up." Mark frowned, glancing at the object on the kitchen table. "But if it was so dangerous, why did they keep it at all?" Ellen shrugged. "Maybe they thought it could still be useful someday. Maybe they thought someone would figure it out when the time was right." Mark returned to the table, staring at the sphere. "It's more than just useful. This thing is alive in a way. It reacts, it responds. What if they were onto something bigger than just a power source?" Ellen sat beside him, her eyes on the faint patterns etched into the metal surface. But they couldn't control it. That's why they stopped. Mark leaned back, his mind racing. What if we can control it? If we can figure out what Welton was trying to do, maybe we can finish his work safely. Or, Ellen countered, we could be opening Pandora's box. Mark, they sealed it away for a reason. For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of their discovery hung heavy in the air. The sphere sat between them, its etched surface dim and silent now, but they both knew the energy it held wasn't gone. It was just dormant. Ellen finally broke the silence. "So what's the next step?" Mark exhaled slowly. "We keep digging. We find everything we can about Welton, his work, and what this thing was supposed to do. And we make sure we don't repeat his mistakes." The following day, Mark and Ellen agreed to approach the sphere more cautiously. They kept it wrapped and hidden in the basement, only bringing it out when the kids were asleep. They decided to focus on gathering information rather than experimenting. Mark spent hours reading through every diagram and formula in the notebooks, while Ellen continued her research on Arthur Welton's life and disappearance. It wasn't long before Ellen found another intriguing lead, an old, faded photograph in an online museum archive. The photo showed Welton standing beside a large, oddly shaped device that bore similarities to the sphere. Beside him was a small group of individuals, likely assistants or fellow researchers. Behind them, the walls of a laboratory were lined with equipment, including the same intricate gauges and tools they had found in the basement. "There," Ellen said, pointing at the screen. "That's him, and that's something connected to the sphere." Mark leaned in, studying the device in the photo. It looks like he was building something larger. The sphere was just one piece. "But what was it for?" Ellen asked. "Every article mentions resonance and new energy, but nothing explains what he was trying to power." "Maybe he didn't even know," Mark said, flipping through the notebooks. "This entry talks about unexpected effects, something about an energy pulse that wasn't supposed to happen." Ellen frowned. "Energy pulse? Like the one we felt the other night?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, but the notes stop right after that. It's like they hit a wall and gave up. Or maybe Welton didn't want to write down what happened next." As they sifted through more notes, one thing became clear. Welton's work hadn't just been theoretical. He'd conducted full-scale tests, and something had gone wrong. The phrase, "unintended dimensional distortion," appeared repeatedly in the later pages, circled and underlined, but without any further explanation. "Dimensional distortion?" Ellen read aloud. "What does that even mean?" Mark shook his head. "I'm not sure. Maybe it's just bad terminology. He could have been trying to describe some kind of electrical anomaly." "Or," Ellen said, her voice quiet, "he was dealing with something we don't understand." Mark looked up at her. "You're saying this thing might not just be a power source? It could be something else entirely?" Ellen hesitated. "I don't know, but the fact that it reacts to us, that it emits energy pulses, it doesn't feel like just another machine. And if Welton thought he was creating energy, maybe he ended up opening a door he didn't mean to." Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at the notebooks spread across the table. "If that's true, then we need to be very careful. We don't know what we're dealing with." Ellen nodded. "Exactly, and whatever we do next, we need to be ready for whatever happens. Because something tells me this sphere is more than just an invention. It's a connection to something much bigger." That evening, Mark and Ellen decided to return the sphere to its resting place in the basement. It wasn't fear so much as caution. Until they had a clearer understanding of what it was, they wanted to keep it contained. The kids were tucked into bed, and the house was quiet as the couple carried the object back down the stairs. They set the sphere on the heavy wooden table, wrapping it again in the thick cloth they'd been using to shield it. But as Mark began folding the fabric around its surface, the hum returned, a low, steady vibration that resonated through the room. "Mark," Ellen said sharply, stepping back, "you didn't turn anything on." "I know," he replied, his hand frozen over the sphere. "I didn't do anything." The hum grew louder, and the circuits along the sphere's surface began to glow once more. But this time it wasn't the faint rhythmic pulse they'd seen before. The patterns shifted and swirled, forming new shapes and symbols. A faint light filled the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Mark reached for the wires they'd used previously, but Ellen grabbed his arm. "Don't touch it." "I'm not doing this," he said, his voice tense. "It's reacting on its own." The sphere began to emit a series of sharp, clear tones, like a musical sequence, but not one they recognized. Ellen realized her pulse was racing. "What's triggering it?" Maybe it's proximity," Mark said, taking a step back. The tone softened, but the light and hum remained steady. Ellen's mind raced, remembering the phrase she'd read earlier in the notes, unintended dimensional distortion. Was this what Welton had experienced before he sealed the room? Was the sphere responding to something beyond their control? "We need to stop it," Ellen said. "Cover it again, completely." Mark nodded, carefully draping the cloth over the sphere until the glow was hidden. The hum persisted for a few moments, then slowly faded. The room fell silent again, and the air felt heavy, charged with static. They stood still, waiting, but the sphere remained quiet. "What just happened?" Ellen asked, her voice hushed. Mark looked at her, his expression grim. "I think it's trying to do something, and whatever that is, we're not ready for it." Ellen glanced around the basement, half expecting the room to change or shift in some subtle way. "We need to lock this down again. Put it back behind that wall and seal it like they did." Mark hesitated. "Maybe. But first I want to find out why it's reacting now, why it started after all these years." Ellen shook her head, but didn't argue. As they turned to leave the basement, she couldn't help glancing back at the table, at the sphere hidden under its cover. It felt as if it were waiting, quietly biding its time. Ellen couldn't sleep. The events in the basement replayed over and over in her mind. Every note they had read, every pulse the sphere had emitted, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The sphere wasn't just a machine. It was active, perhaps even aware. And every time they interacted with it, they were setting something into motion. Mark was sitting at the kitchen table when she came downstairs. He had the notebooks open again, along with his laptop. He didn't look up as she approached, his fingers tapping restlessly on the table. "Mark, we have to stop," Ellen said quietly. "We need to seal it up again. Let it go. Whatever it's meant to do, it's not worth the risk." "I know," he said, but his voice was distant. "I know. But I also think we might be the only ones who can figure this out. What if it's dangerous in the wrong hands? What if it's been waiting for someone who can handle it responsibly?" Ellen shook her head. "You're not thinking straight. If Welton couldn't handle it, how can we?" Mark finally looked up, his face tired but resolute. "Because we've seen more than he did. We know where he failed. And I think I can do it. Just one more test. If I can stabilize the field, we can understand it." Ellen wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't going to let this go without one last attempt. "Fine," she said reluctantly. "One test, but if it starts reacting again, we stop. Immediately." Mark nodded, and together they went back into the basement. The sphere sat quietly on the table, its surface dark and still under the cloth. Mark carefully unwrapped it, his movements deliberate. He had set up a new array of instruments, an oscilloscope, a stronger power supply, and a laptop running the latest diagnostic software. It was more sophisticated than anything Welton would have had in the 1940s. "Okay," Mark said, taking a deep breath. "I'm going to keep the current low, just enough to get a reading." Ellen stood back, watching tensely. Mark connected the probes and turned on the power supply. At first, nothing happened. The oscilloscope displayed a flat line. The sphere remained dark. Then, gradually, a faint hum returned. The line on the scope began to wiggle, a subtle oscillation that matched the notes in Welton's diagrams. "It's stabilizing," Mark said, just like they wrote. "The frequency..." He adjusted a dial and the line smoothed out. The sphere's surface began to glow softly, its circuits forming precise, repeating patterns. The light didn't flicker this time. It held steady. Ellen felt a chill. "Mark, we need to stop. You don't know what's coming next." But Mark shook his head. "I think it's working. I think we're..." Before he could finish, the hum rose sharply. The light intensified, flooding the room in an unnatural glow. The oscilloscope's line spiked, and the air itself seemed to ripple. Ellen stepped back, shielding her eyes as the sphere's glow enveloped them. A blinding flash filled the basement, followed by a deep, resonating silence. Ellen's ears rang as she stumbled backward, her vision struggling to adjust. When the light finally faded, the sphere remained on the table, but its glow was gone, leaving only its intricate etchings visible under the dim basement bulb. "Mark!" Ellen called, her voice shaking. "What happened?" Mark was standing motionless near the table, his eyes wide. He slowly turned to her, his face pale. "I don't know. It just released something." "What do you mean, something?" Ellen demanded, stepping closer. Mark shook his head, his hands trembling. The field stabilized, just like in the notes. But then the energy... He broke off, his gaze fixated on the wall behind Ellen. "Look." She turned to see the once solid basement wall shimmering faintly. The air near the bricks seemed to ripple, almost as if she were looking through a heat mirage. Ellen took an involuntary step back, her heart pounding. "What is that?" I think it's a distortion," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's what the notes mentioned. Dimensional distortion. Welton's resonance field must have opened something." Ellen felt a chill run down her spine. "Opened what? A portal? Another dimension?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He stepped cautiously toward the wall, reaching out as if to touch the shimmer. Ellen grabbed his arm. "Don't! We don't know what it is." He hesitated, then pulled his hand back. "If we can see it, maybe we can measure it, maybe we can figure out what it connects to. Or maybe we're looking at something we can't control," Ellen said firmly. "We need to stop. We need to shut this down before it gets worse." Mark nodded reluctantly, his focus still on the rippling air. "Okay, we'll stop. But we have to document what's happened here. It's unprecedented." Ellen was about to respond when a faint sound reached her ears. A low, distant hum, different from the sphere's previous noises. It was coming from the wall, growing louder, deeper. She backed away, pulling Mark with her. "What's that?" "I don't know," Mark said, his voice tight. "It's like..." A sudden burst of light flared from the shimmer, illuminating the basement in a cold, unearthly glow. Ellen threw her arms up, shielding her face. When the light faded again, the wall appeared solid once more, as if nothing had happened. The sphere sat quietly on the table, its surface dark and still. The hum was gone, the rippling air no longer visible, but Ellen knew what they'd seen wasn't a trick of the light. Something had opened and then closed. Mark stared at the wall, his voice barely audible. "I think we just saw what Welton was afraid of." In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house grew heavy. Ellen and Mark were careful not to mention what had happened in front of the kids, but the tension was impossible to hide. Every evening after dinner, they retreated to the basement, not to experiment further, but to discuss their next steps. The sphere sat quietly on the table, its glow dormant, yet its presence felt larger than ever. "We can't keep this here," Ellen said one night, her voice firm. "It's not safe, Mark. You saw what happened. That a distortion or whatever it was, it could happen again." "I know," Mark said, running a hand through his hair, "but we can't just get rid of it. What if someone else finds it? What if they try to use it?" Ellen crossed her arms, frustration etched on her face. "And what if we try to keep it and something worse happens? This isn't something we can control. Welton couldn't control it. Whoever sealed it up couldn't control it." Mark paced the length of the room. He'd been grappling with that same thought ever since the wall had shimmered. What they had witnessed went beyond science, beyond anything he could fully understand, and yet part of him couldn't let it go. The sphere represented knowledge, possibility, something extraordinary, but at what cost? "If we could figure out what Welton was trying to do," Mark said hesitantly, We might be able to shut it down for good, not just lock it away, but really neutralize it. Ellen shook her head. And how do we know we won't make it worse in the process? I'm telling you, the safest thing is to take it somewhere remote and bury it, somewhere no one will find it. Mark stopped pacing and looked at her. What if burying it isn't enough? What if the energy it gives off... Mark, Ellen interrupted, her voice rising. We're not scientists. We don't have a lab. We don't have the equipment or the knowledge to do this safely. It's too big for us. Her words hung in the air, and Mark slumped into the old chair in the corner, the fight draining out of him. Deep down, he knew she was right. They had stumbled onto something that was never meant to be uncovered again. And though he hated the thought of losing the opportunity to understand it, he hated the thought of endangering his family even more. You're right, he said finally, his voice quiet. We'll bury it. Ellen let out a relieved breath, but it was short-lived. We'll have to find a place far enough away, somewhere no one goes. Mark nodded. We'll plan it out, first thing tomorrow. The sphere sat silently in the center of the table, seemingly inert, but both Mark and Ellen felt a weight lift from their shoulders. They had made their choice. The sphere, whatever it was, would be put to rest once and for all. The next morning, Mark and Ellen woke before sunrise. They told the kids they were running an errand and packed the sphere into a sturdy, locked crate, padding it carefully with old blankets. Mark loaded the crate into the back of their SUV while Ellen packed a shovel and gloves. Neither spoke much. The plan had already been decided. Find an isolated spot in the woods beyond the old logging trails, dig deep, and leave the sphere where it couldn't harm anyone. The drive was long and silent. The road turned from pavement to gravel and finally to dirt as they entered the dense forest. Sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, casting dappled shadows over the windshield. Ellen glanced over at Mark, his knuckles tight on the steering wheel. You sure about this? She asked quietly. No, he admitted, but it's the only thing we can do. When they reached a clearing far from any marked trails, they parked the car and stepped out into the stillness of the woods. The air was cool, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. Mark grabbed the shovel and Ellen carried the crate. Together, they walked into the thick undergrowth until the car was out of sight. This should be far enough, Ellen said, scanning the area. No one's going to come here. Mark nodded and began digging. The soil was damp and heavy and the work was slow. Neither of them complained. The repetitive motion was grounding, helping them focus on the task at hand. With each shovelful of dirt, the hole grew wider and deeper, until Mark finally stopped and wiped the sweat from his brow. That's deep enough, he said. Let's get it over with. They lowered the crate into the hole, the dull thud of its weight hitting the bottom, sending a final solid note through the air. Ellen felt a strange pang of sadness, as if they were saying goodbye to something that had been part of their lives for longer than it had. Mark looked down at the crate for a moment, then began filling the hole. It took less time to bury the sphere than it had to dig the hole. Once the dirt was packed in, Mark and Ellen stood over the disturbed earth, their breaths visible in the cool morning air. Ellen reached out and took Mark's hand. It's done, she said softly. Yeah, Mark replied, his voice low. It's done. They turned back toward the car, leaving the clearing behind. The forest was quiet again, the sphere now hidden and silent beneath the ground. As they walked, Mark glanced back once, just once, before looking ahead. Their secret was buried, their family was safe, and the mystery of the sphere would remain undisturbed, its story left unfinished and forgotten. Life gradually returned to normal for the Harpers. The house once again felt warm and inviting, the air no longer heavy with tension. Ellen spent her mornings in the garden with Lily, planting flowers and teaching her how to care for them. Jake and Mark worked together to build a treehouse in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. The notebooks, the diagrams, and all traces of the sphere were carefully boxed up and stored away in the attic. Mark and Ellen didn't talk about the sphere anymore. It wasn't an unspoken rule. Rather, it seemed understood. They had made their choice. The past was buried, both literally and figuratively, and they didn't want to stir it up again. But on quiet evenings, when the kids were in bed and the house was still, Ellen sometimes caught Mark staring out the window, lost in thought. She knew he was wondering about what they had found, about what might have been, about the questions left unanswered. complexjade@toru.org. "Do you regret it?" Ellen asked one night, breaking the silence. Mark turned from the window and shook his head. "No," he said after a pause. "I don't regret it. I just wonder." "Wonder what?" "What it could have done," he admitted. "If it really was dangerous, if we could have learned something from it, if we made the right call." Ellen reached out and took his hand. "We did the right thing, Mark. We kept our family safe. That's all that matters." He nodded, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "You're right, we're safe. That's what counts." The days turned into weeks, and the memory of the sphere faded. The Harpers focused on their lives, their home, and their children's happiness. The basement became just a basement again, used for storage and forgotten projects. The locked door was left as it was, a strange quirk of the house, a story that would never need to be told. In time, even the Harpers' curiosity waned. They no longer thought about the notebooks hidden away in the attic or the strange symbols etched into the sphere. It was as though the object had been a fleeting dream, something unreal that had simply passed through their lives. The questions it raised, the possibilities it hinted at, they no longer haunted them. Years later, as Ellen and Mark watched Jake and Lily run through the yard, their laughter ringing out under a golden sunset, the decision they had made felt like the only one they could have made. The mystery of the sphere remained buried, its secrets lost to the earth. For the Harpers, life moved forward, untouched by what lay beneath the soil, forgotten but not erased. Years later, the Harper family had settled comfortably into their home, the excitement of their initial move now a distant memory. The house had become a backdrop to their lives, filled with warmth, laughter, and countless small milestones. The once unfinished basement was now a functional storage space, lined with shelves neatly labeled with holiday decorations, old sports equipment, and boxes of forgotten toys. Jake, now a teenager, had outgrown the curiosity that once had him sneaking down the basement steps. Lily, a few years younger, spent more time texting friends than hunting for secrets. To the kids, the house was just a house. But Ellen and Mark never forgot. They never spoke of the sphere again, not to the children, not to each other. They had buried it. Physically, yes, but also emotionally. It became a shared, silent understanding between them, something acknowledged only in fleeting glances or brief moments of reflection. The day came when Mark found himself standing alone at the edge of the yard, looking toward the line of trees where they had driven years ago to bury the sphere. He couldn't explain what had drawn him out there, but something about the quiet afternoon made him pause. Ellen noticed him from the kitchen window and stepped outside, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Mark," she called softly. He turned, his expression thoughtful. "Just remembering." Ellen walked over, standing next to him. She followed his gaze, though the trees revealed nothing unusual. The forest was as still and serene as it had always been. "It's still out there," Mark said after a long silence. Ellen nodded. "It hasn't hurt anyone, it's over." "I know," Mark replied. "But sometimes I wonder, did we do enough? Did we make the right choice?" "We made the choice that kept our family safe," Ellen said firmly, and that was enough. Mark exhaled, the weight of the years and the decision they had made settling over him. You're right. We're safe. The kids are happy. That's what matters. Ellen leaned her head against his shoulder. We closed that chapter a long time ago, Mark. We can't change it now. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden rays over the yard, Mark turned away from the trees. Ellen took his hand, and together they walked back toward the house, leaving behind the questions, the what-ifs, and the mystery of the sphere. Their choice had been made. The past was buried. Inside, the house was full of light and laughter, just as they had always wanted it to be. The Harpers' lives had moved forward, untouched by the secrets locked away in the basement or the object hidden beneath the soil. For them, this new chapter was about their family, their future, and the knowledge that they had done what they believed was right. The Sphere's story was over. Their story was still being written. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring you even more amazing content.